tears are in your eyes, I'll dry them all. I'm on your side. When times get tough and friends around be found, like a bridge over troubled water, I will lay me down, like a bridge over troubled water. I will lay me down. When you're down and out, when you're on the street, when the evening falls so hard, I'll comfort you. I'll take your part. When darkness comes and pain is all around, like a bridge over troubled water, I will lay me down, like a bridge over troubled water. I will lay me down. Like a bridge over troubled water, I will lay me down.
Have you ever experienced that? Have you ever felt that? Just that feeling overwhelmed, feeling just weary, feeling just exhausted or just down to where tears seem to be just welling up? Have you ever experienced that? Have you ever felt that in your life to where all you want is that bridge over those troubled waters? You know, guys, I've experienced that. Remember several years ago that I had experienced some things in my life that were extremely discouraging. And it wasn't just one thing or a couple things, it was a season of things. it was one relational thing after another family thing, after some works things, and it was just over and over and over, week after week, month after month. And over time, that discouragement, because it just kept coming, that discouragement led to a place of despair, where I lost hope, where I lost, this positive energy. And eventually, it led to depression. And I remember at that time having some feelings and thoughts along these lines that I would think to myself, I thought, I've got 5 great sons and they're amazing. And I had this thought that would say, I think they'll be fine. I think they'll be fine. I remember having the thought to think about, in my life I experienced some pretty cool things and, through professional golf and through North Point, met some incredible people. And I thought, I've had a pretty good life. I've had a pretty good life. And I remember thinking about you guys in North Point, and I thought, man, God's allowed us to have a pretty incredible impact, and God's going to allow us to have an impact long after I'm gone. And then I remember having the thought, I think it's time for me to go. I am exhausted. And I had lost my joy. I'd lost my hope. I remember one of my sons at that time asking me, Dad, why don't you laugh? Dad, why don't you laugh? And I looked at my son, and there was no way I could tell him the truth. I said, I laugh. But I was so far underwater. I felt so pressed down in life that I'd lost view of the surface. I'd lost hope to ever getting to the surface and taking air into my lungs and allowing the sun to hit my skin and feel the warmth of life. I'd lost all hope. And I was ready to check out. And at that time, if you were to ask me on the other side of me, you were to say, hey, Buck, how are you doing? How are things going in your life? You know what I would reply? I'm fine. I'm fine. And then as quickly as I could, I would move to deflection, the art of deflection. How about you? What's going on in your life? How's your family? How are things going on with your business? But this was a lie. This was a lie. I wasn't doing fine. I was depressed. And I was wrestling with depression. So my question is, have you ever experienced that? Have you ever felt that? Have you ever felt so pressed down and underwater that you've lost hope? See, guys, if the research is right, if the information and the studies are right, the reality is you will, or you will, or somebody that you love, somebody on the other side of you that you love the very most, they're going to go through it. Because according to the latest research, look at this, 30% of Americans are showing signs of clinical anxiety or depression amid the coronavirus pandemic. Going into COVID, depression was on the rise. But with COVID and the whole pandemic, everything has been exacerbated. Or how about this? The research goes on to say depression is the leading cause of disability in the world. You want to talk about why people can't go to work and people who really want to provide for their families, they just feel so debilitated, they can't even move forward, they can't get out of bed. It's depression. It's the number one. And then when it comes to men and women, this is interesting. Women are nearly twice as likely as men to have depression. So what we're talking about today, ladies, it's important that you lean in. And when it comes to students, college-age students, severe depression among college students rose from 9.4 to 21.1 from 2013 to 2018 and has only risen since then. And when it comes to our kids, my sons and your sons and daughters, look at this. The rate of moderate to severe depression rose from 23% to 41% from 2007 to 2018 and has only risen since. And guys, if we were ever to talk about something in this series, we're in part 3 of this series about mental health. If we were ever to talk about a subject, we must talk about depression. And guys, I want to be very upfront and honest with you. And I want to be upfront about two quick things. Number one is today I'm not going to patronize you. I'm really not. I'm not going to give you some quick fix and, hey, just, do these 2 things plus this is going to equal done with depression. You're going to be free and you're going to have hope and it's going to be awesome. If you've ever gone through depression, you know how patronizing that would be for me to do. I'm not going to do that. Depression is far too complex. And secondly, I want to be upfront with you about the fact that regardless of where you're at on the spectrum in terms of discouragement to despair to depression, what we're going to talk about today, I think is going to be helpful for all of us. But I do need to be upfront that today I'm going to lead towards despair or depression. I'm going to speak to those of you who are either going through that or have been through that, or the person you love the very most is. And my hope today for those of you who perhaps there's some discouraging things in your life, but you would say, well, I'm not experiencing despair or depression, is my hope for you today as you walk out or as you're in your living room and you finish up and, after today's message, my hope is that you have more empathy. My hope is that you understand more about the people that you interact with who are going through depression and what is actually happening inside of them. That's my hope for today. So guys, when it comes to depression, I think it's really important to understand the root of this word. It actually comes from a Latin word, depressio, and it literally means to press down. It's like that illustration I gave you to where it's like being pressed underwater so far to where you can't see the surface, to where you actually lose hope to ever getting to the surface and allowing the air to fill your lungs and that kind of hope in life. That's depression. And depression isn't a few drops of like sadness or a few drops of grief or a few drops of tragedy. No, depression is much more like a storm system. I mean, we had a storm system come in over the last week that is unprecedented. I mean, and it's like that. Depression is like the storm system comes in on your life and it settles and it stalls. And it's not just for a week, but it's week after week after week after week, month after month, and it just pours. That's depression. And depression is so complex. It invades our life in so many different ways. I mean, for some, you would say, well, maybe depression is a result of a genetic story. That's your story because you saw depression in your father. And you saw depression in your grandfather. And now you look in the mirror and now you think about what's going on inside and the thoughts you have in your mind. And you're going, oh my gosh, I feel like I'm experiencing the very same things I saw in my father. Or maybe for you, it came on the best day of your life. Because when your son was born, when your daughter was born, you would say, that was the best day of my life. But then postpartum depression set in. And now just feeding your son or daughter, or just taking care of the greatest joy in your life is extraordinarily difficult. Or maybe depression set in as a result of a tragedy or a traumatic event in your life that just cracked your soul. Or maybe it's a result of an addiction and you've been battling this addiction for years and years, but now it seems like the addiction is won and you've given up hope. There's no way you're going to overcome this thing. Or maybe depression set in when you walked out of divorce court. And you thought, man, this reality, never thought it would come my way at all. And guys, I'm telling you, if it does, or perhaps the better phrase, when it does, perhaps in your life or the person you love the very most, what we end up doing is we want that bridge over those troubled waters. If you've ever been on the other side of somebody who's wrestling with depression and you see that despair and the loss of hope, you want to do everything you can to help them. And oftentimes what we do is we go to Google and we start researching and go, what are things that are helpful and practical and can provide hope and can just put one foot in front of the other. And if you go to Google, you're going to find a great list of things that are extraordinarily helpful. I mean, at Google, you'll find this list to go in depression. You must exercise. Whatever it takes, you got to exercise. I mean, there's a great study out there with thousands of chronically depressed individuals who 65% of them began to see signs of hope and feel that sense of freedom because they took a 30-minute walk every single day. I mean, you got to exercise. Whatever it takes, exercise. I mean, eat right. Your diet is so important. Be grateful. Meditate. Whatever kind of form of meditation you want. It's all helpful. Don't believe feelings. I mean, those feelings there's just so many of those are lies. Be honest with what you're feeling. Don't isolate. Isolation is one of the worst things you can do in depression. And volunteer getting other people's lives. I mean, see that you're not alone, that people around you are going through difficulty as well. And guys, here's the deal. All of this is helpful. All of this is a great step forward. It's like, man, how do I begin to break free? How do I just get a little bit of air? Well, this can provide a little bit of air. And if you're a Christian, we also have a list. And the list would be something like this. Make sure and pray. I mean, if you're depressed, you got to make sure to pray, go to church, read your Bible, stay connected. I mean, this whole series, we're talking about how important it is to be connected. I mean, remember God's promises, count your blessing. And guys, those are important. I mean, those are right. Those are correct. Those are things that we can do to take a step to begin to move towards the surface, to begin to build that bridge over those troubled waters. And I think those are important. But can I just be really honest? If you've ever gone through depression, or if you know somebody, oftentimes this list actually compounds depression. Because you wake up in the morning and you're like, okay, I didn't pray, I didn't exercise, I didn't eat right, because all I want to do is eat the worst foods for me because they make me feel a little bit, better. And all I want to do is feel better, and I'm eating the worst foods, and man, I wasn't thankful, I didn't volunteer at all. And now all of a sudden, you feel more depressed than before because of the list. So the question is, what do we do? How do we begin to move forward? How do we begin to take a step over that bridge of troubled waters? Well, guys, one of the things I absolutely love about the Bible is experientially true. I mean, one of the tests of truth, there's 4 tests of truth, but one of the tests of truth is to go, is it experientially true? And when you read stories in the Bible, you read stories of real life. You read stories just like you and me and what we're going through. I mean, I think about in the Bible when it comes to depression, I think about Elijah. I mean, Jordan talked about Elijah last week. Elijah was a prophet of God. I mean, a prophet is a mouthpiece of God. In other words, they hear directly from God. And as a prophet, the prophet Elijah, he also saw the miracles manifested before his very eyes that defy the laws of physics happen. I mean, he's seen God. But yet you read the story of Elijah, you find him in a cave, completely depressed, wanting to die. That's in the Bible. Or you read stories of people like King David, who was the anointed king of Israel. I mean, here's a guy who's chosen by God, anointed by God, and here's a guy who the very Messiah, Jesus Christ, is going to come from his lineage. I mean, of all guys whose heart is after God, that you would think would never suffer with depression, it would be David, King David. But King David wrote half the Psalms in the middle of the Bible, and that's like a journal to his thoughts, a journal to his emotions. You read his thoughts and emotions, and you're like, wow, that guy was depressed. There's all kinds of stories. And today, I actually want to show you just one. Today, I want to show you a story of a priest, and it's found in Psalms 42. And this priest, his responsibility was to lead the people of Israel into the promises of God. His responsibility was specific with music. And this priest, every day when he would wake up, he would, think about the promises of God, think about the truths of God, and write them down. And then he would lead a large number of people in celebrations or religious ceremonies to the promises of God, to the goodness of God, to the hope of God. I mean, imagine this individual. Again, you would logically reason that this individual would never suffer with depression, because his hope is always in God. God is his rock. God is his refuge, because he continues to remind the people of these very things. But you read Psalms 42 and about this priest, it's clear he was depressed. In fact, here's his words. It's like a journal. Here's what he says. He says, as the deer pants for the streams of water, so my soul pants for you, my God. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. When can I go and meet with God? And then he says, my tears have been my food day and night, while people say to me all day long, where's your God? Where's your God? In other words, what he's saying is, as a deer pants for water, in other words, think of like a deer being chased by a predator, and the deer is completely out of energy, totally exhausted, and all the deer longs for is a little bit of water, is a little bit of relief. He's like, that's me. And in depression asks questions. And depression asks the question of, where's God? Where's God in this mess? Where's God in this tragedy? Where's God in this financial hardship? Where's God in this storm or this pandemic? Where's God in my marriage? Where's God with my son or daughter? Where's God? So the question is, well, what does this priest do? I mean, because perhaps you have felt those same feelings and ask those very same questions. What do we do? Well, the priest gives us some insight and says, these things I remember as I pour out my soul, how I used to go to the house of God under the protection of the Mighty One with shouts of joy and praise among the festive throng. In other words, man, I remember. And that is key. That is important. And depression is to remember what's true. Don't forget what's true. I mean, remember the goodness of God. Remember the promises of God. Remember the faithfulness of God. And that's a wonderful thing. But let's pause a second and let me ask you a question. Is that what the priest is actually saying in this passage? The answer is no. 2 words. I used to. I used to. I used to remember when I wrote those songs and could walk in and sing about the promises of the Mighty One. I used to do that. And the same reality is true, perhaps for you or for the one that you love who's going through depression. I used to remember how I could tuck my son in at night. I used to remember what my family was like. I used to remember those family vacations. I used to remember that financial security. I used to remember even going to church and actually looking forward to singing music. But now, no longer. And those thoughts of what you used to be able to do, just again, compound depression. So the question is like, is there anything of relief? Is there anything of hope? Well, the priest goes on and says something that I need you to lean into and pay attention to, because this is so helpful. The priest goes on and says, "Why, my soul, are you so downcast?" Talking to his soul. "Why are you just so disturbed within me? Put your hope in God, for I will praise him, my Savior and my God." This is so important. In depression, one of the most important things you can do is talk to what's happening in here. Be curious about your feelings. Be curious about your emotions. Inquire about your thoughts. Why am I thinking this way? What are these emotions? What are these feelings inside of me? And then the priest begins to preach to himself, which is so fantastic. Begins to say, okay, I feel this and I'm asking questions, but here's what's true. God, you are my rock. You are my refuge. That's what's true. And guys, the reason this is so important to be curious about those feelings, be curious about the thoughts and the emotions, is because with depression, about 100 lies a minute invade your mind. I have felt it. I remember several years ago. I mean, it's like every single day, just thought after thought, feeling after feeling would come my way, and it would just sink me further and further and further. I remember a couple thoughts I had would be these, where I would think to myself, I would go, man, all you do is just hurt your sons. You can see the hurt in their life. You can see the result of your choices. All you do is hurt your children, Buck. I'd look at Jill and I'd be like, man, I'd see her struggling, and I would think it's all me. It's all you do is hurt your wife. And everything you try to do to help her, it just ends up hurting her. All you do is hurt your wife. And Buck, all you do is hurt people. Your advice is terrible. And I remember thinking, it's time to go. It's time to check on out. I'm done. I'm exhausted. I'm telling you, with depression, 1,000 feelings and thoughts invade your mind by the minute. And when I experienced that, when those were coming my way, there was someone in my life that was so helpful. Someone in my life who wasn't trying to fix me, but was just walking with me. And that person, as I shared my thoughts with this individual, that person said something to me that was so profound and said, Buck, you need to understand feelings are not facts. Feelings aren't facts. Feelings may feel factual to you. In other words, those feelings and those thoughts, they're real. They feel so true. But your job, Buck, is to be curious. Ask questions. Get to the bottom of those feelings and discern whether or not they're actually true. They feel true, but are they true? And whose voice is that? And where do those feelings come from? And ultimately, what you want to do is get to a place, Buck, that you can say, I don't have faith. Faith is confidence in. Faith in my feelings. I have faith in the facts. I feel unlovable. I feel terrible. Feeling. Fact. God knit me together in my mother's womb, that I am the apple of God's eye. fact that it's so important to be curious, to look into those feelings and those thoughts. So maybe that's our way forward. Maybe with depression, maybe our way forward is to think this: the thing to do that makes depression done is talking to our own hearts. Be curious, ask questions. Whose voice is that? Where's that feeling come from? I mean, where's that generating? Is that from my childhood? I mean, what's going on here? Are these true? Maybe that's it. Or maybe not. Because of what the psalmist, what the priest says next. The very next words, my soul is downcast within me. To which I just want to go to this guy. What's going on here? Where are you at? Because I feel like you're on this roller coaster of, man, I feel underwater, but oh, I have hope. I feel underwater. Oh, I have hope. I mean, you're back and forth. You're all over the place. I mean, what is it? And guys, maybe that's the point. In fact, I think that is the point. That depression is not some simple phrase, some simple formula. Just do this plus this is going to equal done with depression. It's simply not that simple. And I love that this is in the Bible. Because as I alluded to earlier, I mean, there are real people in real history that are feeling the same things, questioning the same things, experiencing what we experience. Depression. It's very real. And I love that's in the Bible. And the reality is, there's no simple fixes. There's no easy formula. And that's really important, especially if you grew up in church. Because if you grew up in church, oftentimes what you heard is, hey, just do this and that, tape these on your mirror and everything will be just fine. It's just, because pastors and priests and reverends, they want to give you hope, and that's important. I mean, that's part of our role. And oftentimes when I think about the church and perhaps your religious experiences, or maybe from a distance, some religious experiences you've had, or maybe some Christians you knew who talked about what to do in depression, maybe it's kind of like this. Here's how I want to illustrate it. Think about this movie. And if you have kids, you've probably seen this movie. It's called Inside Out. And the movie's all about emotions and how your emotions kind of interact with one another. And in the movie, there's the emotion of sadness. And sadness looks like this. This is sadness. And all throughout the movie, sadness is just knocked down. And sadness has joy, and joy is the other emotion that in the movie continues to talk to sadness and says, sadness, just do these two things and it'll get you back up on your feet. Do these three things. It'll just help you walk again, give you some relief. Come on, sadness. Come on, sadness. And sadness gives us a shot. I mean, sadness is like, okay, I'll do it. And sadness begins to get on her feet, and she falls back down, falls back down, falls back down. And I'm telling you, when I think of that tension in the movie, it reminds me of the same tension I see in the church. Where in the church, it's this idea. It's Jesus. Hey, all you need is Jesus. I mean, Jesus will give you the right phrase. Just pray the right prayer. Just do the right things. Just tape the right things on your mirror. Put the right things on your phone. If you just remind yourself of the promises of God, and don't lose sight of those, then you're going to find that bridge over troubled waters, and it's all going to be okay. Now, let me just say two things. One, anytime you see your pastor with stuffed animals on stage talking about depression, that possibly is depressing you right now, right? I'll just be honest with that. But for the sake of an illustration, my point is this. Guys, I think the church has done a disservice to make this thing so simple, to somehow give some false hope and a little bit of patronizing to go, hey, just tape this one verse and it's your way forward. And I'm not saying those things aren't helpful. Those things aren't beneficial. But it doesn't fix depression. It doesn't allow you to be done with depression. So, what do I say to you? How do I provide some words of hope? Should I say that, you should just pray more? Just do that? Should I just say, hey, be more grateful, count your blessings, it's so important. You'll put 10 things that you're grateful for every single morning, that's going to help. Should I say just stay in church? I mean, I could, and I would be right. I mean, those things are wonderful, and they're very pragmatic, and they're helpful in the moment. But again, it's not what ultimately helps you find that bridge over troubled waters. So what do I say? where do we go with this? Well, something that I think is so important to understand, perhaps that you've never heard of before, is in the Psalms, many of the Psalms are songs. And in the song that this priest is writing, and that would be appropriate because this priest was responsible for music, in a Hebrew song, there's a thing called a chiasm. A chiasm is the main point, the central point, the thing that you cannot miss. Today in modern pop music, in our modern, music culture, I mean, the chiasm, you could say, would be the central theme of the song, and, it's repeated over and over and over and over, and you're like, after you listen to the song, you're like, I get the point, In a Hebrew song, very different. The chiasm in a Hebrew song is so subtle. Sometimes it's only said one time, but it's the whole point. So what's the point the priest is trying to communicate? Well, right in the middle of Psalm 42, you find this. By day, the Lord directs his love. At night, his song is with me. The priest is saying to you and to me, these feelings, man, I feel pressed down. I keep trying to do all these things and capture my thoughts and tell myself what you're... At the end of the day, what I've discovered, those things certainly can be helpful. But the greatest way forward is to know that day or night, God is directing his love and he's with me. That word direct in the Hebrew literally means command. Think of like the 10 Commandments. Maybe you think of thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not murder, thou shalt honor your mother and father. I mean, the commandments of God. It's in the same way that God is commanding his love, that God commands his love. And what this looks like and what the psalmist is saying, it's almost like love is right here with God and you are going through depression. And he sees that and his heart hurts for you and he loves you because God cannot not love because God is love, and by the very nature of God, he must love. And he's looking at love and he's looking at you and what you're going through, and he commands love to go meet you. He directs love to go be with you. He directs love to go bring healing to you. And you may go, well, what does that look like? Can we get practical with that? Well, what's important to understand before we get practical is what the psalmist is saying to you and to me, is God's to-do list for the depressed is not something we do. See, oftentimes we're like, well, we got to do all these things and then I'm going to feel free. No, it's far too complex. It's something that God does. That God directs his love. He commands his love. So how does he do it? Well, guys, I don't think I could give you an exhaustive list because God is infinite. God is God, and by the very nature of God, he does it in so many different ways. But I can tell you my story, and I can tell you how God directed his love for me. And God directed as I thought about, what I experienced and what I'd gone through, I thought about, God directed his love to me in a few different ways, specifically 5. And I thought this week I was thinking, God directed his love through pastors. One of the things I did is I felt so underwater is I would kind of force myself to listen to sermons, listen to teachings of other pastors. And I would listen to a pastor teach about God's love, and I wouldn't feel God's love. But a pastor's role is to declare the truth of God in spite of. A pastor's not going to check in with me and say, hey, how do you feel about God's love? And I'm like, well, I don't feel it today. And then the pastor goes, oh, I was going to talk about God's love, but now I'm not because you don't feel that way, right? A pastor's role is to declare God's truth in spite of. And I would listen to these pastors talk about God's love, talk about the fact that I matter, talk about that God can redeem so many things that I've done in my life, that God's love is big enough to forgive. And over, in spite of what I may or may not felt, these words, these teachings were such an encouragement and would subtly, drip by drip, there was no secret formula, but drip by drip, it's how God commanded his love. God also commanded his love in my life through the Bible. And one of the reasons why I tell you to read the Bible all the time is because it's one of the ways that God directs his love for you. And here's what's interesting. When it comes to the Bible, there's a great app that you can get on your phone that I would highly recommend called YouVersion. My son and I are going through, a Bible plan on there. There's all kinds of great resources on it. But the YouVersion is like the whole Bible. And one of the things you got to do on the YouVersion is pick the version of the Bible, right? You got to pick, is it NIV, TPT, is it NAS, KJV, NKJV? I mean, all the different versions. But one thing I've never found is the RDV version, the really depressed version of the Bible that puts a question mark next to all of God's promises. For God so loved the world? Question mark? I don't know, maybe. For nothing can separate you from God's love? I don't know, maybe. You know, that God is close to the brokenhearted, that God is your rock, your refuge, that God is your place of peace? I don't know. You just won't find it. You see, the Bible is full of God's promises. The Bible is full of declarations of God's truth for your life in all seasons of life. And one of the ways that God would encourage me and declare his love, direct his love, is through the Bible. And again, this is one of the reasons why I want to encourage you. And if the Bible's confusing, I get it. I mean, I've read it. There are lots of confusing things in it. And this is why, ask questions. But for goodness sake, it's so important to read. Another way that God directed his love was through other people. One of the things I share with you from time to time, and maybe it bothers you, maybe it doesn't, but I share with you about my counselor. And I talk quite a bit about counseling. Now, before I got in counseling, if you and I were talking and we were just shooting the bull, and I said, hey, if you were to say, Buck, what do you think about counseling? I would say, I think it's for the weak. I think it's for the unintelligent. I think it's for people who can't pull themselves up by their bootstraps. I think it's for people who don't work hard. I think it's for the lazy. Man, I'm telling you, if you work hard enough, if you can, outsmart it, if you can outread it, if you can outthink it, you can figure it out. Come on. You can do this. That's what I would say to you. Until I couldn't say that any longer. And then I decided to engage with other people and engage with a counselor. And this individual was somebody who walked alongside of me. This individual was somebody who again, didn't try to fix me, just listened to me and actually helped me process a lot of my feelings and a lot of my thoughts and taught me what I shared with you to say, whose voice is that? Who's telling you that? Where did that feeling come from? And began to teach me so many things about my childhood and so many things about my father and so many things about my mother. And so oftentimes how I want to honor instead of be honest with my family of origin. I so want to honor them that I won't be honest about the realities of what happened in my life that now I'm passing on to my sons. So many things I discovered. But ultimately, that God directed his love through other people. And I promise you, there are people who've sent you a text. There are people who want to meet with you. There are people who said, hey, let's go have lunch. There are people who want to bring you a meal. And everything in us wants to isolate. But in depression, one of the ways that God directs his love is through other people. That God also directed his love through doctors. And can I just say one thing about doctors, and I honestly don't get this, and maybe that's my fault. But in Christianity and religion, oftentimes there's this weird, confusing thing to say, it's either depression or faith. Depression or faith. And just if you have more faith, then this is going to go away. It'll take care of itself. And every time I hear that, I think that's absolutely absurd. Because that's like me going to my father who has diabetes and saying, hey, Dad, today you need to pick faith or insulin. Well, you got to pick. That's like me going to my son Jonathan who broke his wrist just a few months ago and saying, hey, Jonathan, it's either faith or cast. You got to pick. And the next day when he walks in with a cast, I'm like, oh, there's my son. You have a little faith, It's so absurd to think that. God has given us incredible medical advancements and all kinds of incredible medicine to fix arms and to fix all kinds of things that are going on in here. And to also help address things that are going on in here. And can I just say this? That there is nothing weak about your faith. If you wake up in the morning and go to your bathroom and there's medicine in your cabinet, there is nothing weak about your faith. One of the ways God directs his love is through doctors. And last of all, again, this is not exhaustive, but most importantly, through Jesus. I'll end with this. One of the things that is so unique and distinct about Christianity over all other world religions is only in Christianity does God come to us. In all other world religions, we come to God. We must do a lot of things to get the peace. We must do a lot of things to get our heads above water. If we do these things, the 5 noble truths, the 5 pillars, whatever it may be, then we can get and experience that peace. Only in Christianity does God so love the world that he made the first move, came in to be with you, to be with me. You know, Jesus, it says that he mourns with those who mourn. He grieves with those who grieves. Jesus experienced so many things that we experience in life so he could empathize. And he could say, me too. Jesus is the one who truly give us rest and a peace that transcends all understanding. That Jesus is close to the brokenhearted. That Jesus truly is a rock and a refuge. So, what do we do to find that bridge over those troubled waters? Well, guys, there's no secret formula. There's no magic sauce. There's no do this and do that and you'll be done. But it's understanding that God directs his love. And one of the greatest ways to experience that is to be able to receive that, to look for it, to open your eyes, to open your heart, to know that God is directing his love through a multitude of ways. And when we can be and embrace God's love and begin to be met by God's love, it begins to build that bridge over those troubled waters that you either will face or someone in your life will face or you are facing. Let me pray for us. Father, thank you so much that today we can have this kind of conversation and that we can talk about the difficult things in life that, honestly, some days I'd rather talk about a lot of other things. But this is real, and you know that. And so, Father, today I pray for those who are really in the midst of depression, that depression, the storms have set in. God, I pray that you meet them in only the ways that you can, that you reveal and direct your love to them, perhaps in new ways, in the most tangible ways. And Father, for those perhaps who aren't wrestling with depression, I just pray that you open our hearts and perhaps soften our hearts, that we can begin to see and to think and to empathize and to understand what people that we love, that what they're really going through. And God, perhaps we can be open to be used by you to direct your love to them. God, open our eyes to that. Show us what that looks like. Thank you so much for this moment. In Jesus' name, amen.